The scorching Texas sun had already claimed 6 lives by the time Oliver Jameson rode into the parched border town of Esperanza in the summer of 1875, his body burning with a fever that threatened to make him the 7th. Oliver's vision blurred as he slumped forward in his saddle, barely conscious enough to register the shouts of concern as locals noticed the wounded cowboy. Blood had soaked through his shirt where the bullet had grazed his side 3 days earlier, and the infection had set in fast. His last memory before darkness claimed him was of rough hands catching him as he slid from his horse, and a woman's voice calling for help. The fever dreams came in waves, visions of the cattle raid gone wrong, of his partners' faces as they fell to the bandits' bullets, of the long, desperate ride north with pursuers hot on his trail. Sometimes he dreamed of home, of Kentucky bluegrass and his mother's voice. Sometimes he dreamed only of fire, of burning from the inside out. When consciousness finally returned, it came slowly, like dawn breaking through storm clouds. Oliver first became aware of the softness beneath him, a real bed, not the hard ground he'd grown accustomed to. Next came the smell of lavender and soap, so different from the trail dust and sweat that had been his companions. Then the soft whispers that shaped themselves into words as his mind cleared. "Watch over this man, Lord. Guide him back to the light if it be your will." Oliver's eyes fluttered open, the effort monumental. Beside his bed knelt a woman, her head bowed in prayer, honey-colored hair falling forward to obscure her face. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, knuckles white with the fervor of her supplication. "Am I dead?" His voice emerged as little more than a rasp, his throat parched from days of fever. The woman's head snapped up, revealing a face that momentarily convinced Oliver that he had indeed passed to the hereafter. Her eyes were the clear blue of a mountain lake, wide with surprise and rimmed with the evidence of recent tears. "You're alive," she breathed, the relief in her voice palpable. She quickly poured water from a pitcher beside the bed and helped him drink. "The doctor wasn't certain you'd survive the night." Oliver drank greedily, the water like nectar to his parched throat. When he'd had his fill, he sank back against the pillows, studying the woman who had apparently been praying for his salvation. "How long have I been here?" he asked. 3 days, she answered, setting the glass aside. "They brought you to my boarding house. I'm Sarah Abernathy. This is my establishment." Oliver tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his side. Sarah's hands were instantly on his shoulders, gently but firmly pressing him back down. "The bullet wound is clean now, but you'll tear the stitches if you move too quickly," she admonished. "Dr. Miller worked hard to save your life. Don't undo his good work." "Oliver Jameson," he offered with a grimace. "I'm obliged to you, Miss Abernathy." "Mrs.," she corrected gently, "though it's been 2 years since my Edward passed." Oliver nodded, taking in the simple but clean room around him. A breeze stirred the curtains at the open window, bringing with it the sounds and smells of a busy western town, horses, dust, and the distant piano notes from what was surely a saloon. "Esperanza," he murmured, remembering the town's name. "I made it across the border then." "Just barely," Sarah confirmed. "Sheriff Daniels has some questions for you when you're stronger, something about a band of raiders and stolen cattle." Oliver closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't steal anything. We were driving our herd north when the Vasquez gang hit us. They killed my partners and took the cattle. I managed to wing one of them before taking a bullet myself. Been riding 3 days to reach American soil." Sarah's expression softened. The sheriff suspected as much. Manuel Vasquez has been terrorizing both sides of the border for months now. She dipped a cloth in cool water and placed it on his forehead. "Rest now, Mr. Jameson. We can talk more when you've regained your strength." "Oliver," he corrected, already feeling sleep tugging at him again. "Just Oliver." As darkness reclaimed him, the last thing he saw was Sarah's face, no longer twisted in prayer, but softened with relief. Her lips curved into a gentle smile that followed him into dreams far sweeter than those that had haunted his fever. The next few days passed in a blur of sleep, broth, and medicine. Oliver grew stronger, the infection retreating from his blood. Sarah was a constant presence, changing his bandages, helping him eat, and sometimes simply sitting beside him, reading aloud from one of her books. On the 4th day, he was strong enough to sit up properly and take a real meal beef stew and fresh bread that made his mouth water after so many days of broth and weak tea. "This is the finest meal I've had in months," he told Sarah as she sat in a chair near the window, mending one of his shirts. "Trail cooking doesn't compare." "It's nothing special," she demurred, though a pleased flush colored her cheeks. "Just simple food." Nothing simple about it to a man who's been eating beans and hardtack for weeks on end. He studied her as she worked, noting the care with which she repaired the bullet hole in his shirt. "You didn't have to do that." "It's no trouble," she replied, not looking up from her stitching. "Besides, a man shouldn't have to ride with a hole in his shirt that reminds him of how close he came to death." There was something in her voice that made Oliver wonder what losses she'd endured beyond her husband. This was a harsh land, and Sarah Abernathy had the look of a woman who had weathered her share of storms. "Tell me about your boarding house," he said, changing the subject. "I'd like to know what sort of establishment I've imposed upon." This brought a genuine smile to her lips. "It's modest, but respectable. 6 rooms besides my own small quarters in the back. Currently, I have 2 permanent boarders, Mr. Peterson, the school teacher, and Miss Winters, who works at the mercantile. The other rooms I rent to travelers passing through. And business is good? Good enough to keep a roof over my head and food on the table." Her needle flashed in the sunlight as she finished the last stitch. "Edward left some debts when the consumption took him, but I've nearly paid them all." Oliver nodded, impressed by her fortitude. Many widows in the territories either remarried quickly or returned east to family. Running a business alone took courage. "And you, Mr. Jameson?" Sarah asked, setting aside her mending. "What brings a Kentucky man so far from home?" Oliver raised an eyebrow. "My accent gives me away?" "That and your fever talk. You called for your mother and spoke of Bluegrass Hills." He smiled ruefully. "Haven't been back to Kentucky since the war ended. Came west with nothing but my horse and saddle. Found work with cattle outfits, saved enough to buy in as a partner on this drive." His expression darkened. "Fat lot of good it did Jim and Marcus. Now they're dead and the herd's gone." "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. "Will you return to try and recover your cattle?" Oliver's jaw tightened. "Vasquez has probably already sold them off or butchered them, and I'm not fool enough to go after him alone." He shook his head. "No, I'll have to start over, again." Before Sarah could respond, a knock came at the door. She rose to open it, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with a star pinned to his vest. "Sheriff Daniels," she greeted him. "Mr. Jameson is awake and much improved today." The sheriff nodded to her, then removed his hat as he entered the room. "Glad to hear it. Mind if I have a word with him?" "Of course not. I'll bring some coffee." Sarah slipped out, leaving the 2 men alone. Sheriff Daniels pulled the chair closer to Oliver's bed and sat, studying him with shrewd eyes beneath bushy brows. "So, you're the man who outran Manuel Vasquez." It wasn't a question. "Not by much," Oliver admitted. "Lucky you made it across the river when you did. Had a runner from the Mexican rurales yesterday. They found 3 of Vasquez's men dead near Los Lobos. Seems someone put up quite a fight. Jim and Marcus were good men. They didn't go down easy." The sheriff nodded gravely. "And the cattle. 200 head of prime beef cattle, branded Circle J. We were driving them to the railhead at Abilene. All your stock?" "Mine and my partner's. We pooled everything we had." Oliver's hands clenched on the bedsheet. 3 years of work gone in an afternoon. Sheriff Daniels leaned forward. "Here's the thing, Jameson. Vasquez has been hitting outfits on both sides of the border for months now. The Mexican authorities can't catch him, and he's too smart to give me jurisdiction by crossing into Texas, at least until your encounter." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that bullet you put in one of his men left a trail. They found blood leading north across the river, not far from where I found you half dead on your horse." Oliver's pulse quickened. "You think they followed me into Texas?" "I know they did. Question is whether they're still here, licking their wounds, or if they've headed back to their hideout." Sarah returned with coffee, her face concerned as she caught the tail end of their conversation. "Surely they wouldn't come into town," she said as she handed each man a cup. "Wouldn't put anything past Vasquez," the sheriff replied grimly. "But no, I don't think they'd risk it. More likely they're holed up somewhere in the hills, waiting for a chance to settle the score with Mr. Jameson here before heading back." Oliver met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "What do you want from me, Sheriff?" "Information for now. Anything you can tell me about their numbers, weapons, which way they were headed with the cattle." He sipped his coffee. "And when you're back on your feet, maybe some help bringing them to justice." "I'm no lawman." "No, but you're a man with a score to settle. And you've seen their operation firsthand." The sheriff set down his cup. "Rest up, Jameson. We'll talk more when you're stronger." After the sheriff left, Sarah remained by the window, her expression troubled. "You're not thinking of going after those men, are you?" Oliver looked at her, taking in the genuine concern in her eyes. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now," he gestured to his wounded side, "I've had a stark reminder of my mortality." "Good," she said firmly, "because praying over one deathbed is quite enough for me this month." Despite the gravity of their conversation, Oliver found himself smiling at her forthright manner. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Abernathy." "See that you do," she replied, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Over the next week, Oliver's strength returned rapidly. Sarah continued to care for him, changing his bandages and bringing him increasingly substantial meals. Dr. Miller visited twice more, pronounced him healing well, and finally gave permission for him to leave his bed for short periods. On his first venture downstairs to the boarding house's common room, Oliver met Sarah's other boarders. Nathaniel Peterson, the schoolteacher, was a slender young man with spectacles and earnest enthusiasm for bringing education to the frontier. Lillian Winters, the mercantile clerk, was a quiet, plain woman of about 30, who blushed furiously whenever Oliver addressed her directly. "Mr. Jameson has been our own local mystery," Sarah explained as she served dinner that evening. "The cowboy who appeared half dead and has been recuperating in my best room." "We're glad to see you on the mend, sir," Peterson said, passing the bread. "Mrs. Abernathy has been quite concerned for your welfare." Sarah shot the schoolteacher a look that Oliver couldn't quite interpret. "I would be concerned for any guest under my roof," she said primly. "Of course," Peterson replied, though his knowing smile suggested otherwise. Later that evening, when the others had retired, Oliver found Sarah alone in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes. "Let me help," he offered, taking a towel to dry the plates she had cleaned. "You should be resting," she protested, though she didn't stop him. "I've rested enough. A man can only lie abed so long before he starts feeling useless." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the splash of water and the clink of dishes. Outside, the night was alive with the sounds of Esperanza distant piano music, occasional laughter, the clip-clop of horses passing by. "I'll need to find work soon," Oliver said finally. "I can't impose on your hospitality much longer." Sarah's hand stilled in the soapy water. "You're not imposing. You're a paying guest." "With what money?" He laughed without humor. "Everything I had was invested in those cattle or spent on supplies for the drive. I have exactly $2.47 to my name right now." "Oh." Sarah resumed washing, her movements more deliberate. "I hadn't realized. I'll speak to the sheriff tomorrow. Maybe he knows of an outfit looking for hands." Oliver set down a dried plate carefully. "I'm a good worker, Mrs. Abernathy. I'll pay my debt to you before I leave Esperanza." Sarah looked up at him then, her blue eyes serious in the lamplight. "There's no rush, Mr. Jameson. You're still healing." "Oliver," he reminded her gently, "and I heal fast." A faint flush colored her cheeks. "Oliver, then, and I suppose you may call me Sarah, as it seems silly to stand on formality with a man I've nursed through a fever." Oliver smiled. "Sarah, it suits you. Biblical name, princess." "You know your scripture," she observed, looking pleased. "My mother made sure of it, read to us every night from the family Bible." He handed her the towel as she emptied the wash basin. "She would have liked you." The words slipped out before he could consider them, and Oliver immediately felt foolish. But Sarah didn't seem offended by the presumption. Instead, she folded the towel neatly and hung it to dry. "I have a proposition for you," she said, turning to face him. "My handyman left last month for California, gold fever, though heaven knows the rush played out years ago. In any case, this old house needs constant attention. And I haven't found a replacement yet." Oliver raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Abernathy? Sarah, she corrected. And yes, I suppose I am. Room and board, plus a small wage once you're fully recovered, just until you decide what you want to do next. It was charity, thinly disguised as employment, and they both knew it. But Oliver's pride warred with his practical nature. He had no money, no prospects, and enemies possibly still looking for him. A few weeks of light work while he regained his strength and planned his next move wasn't the worst idea. I accept, he said finally. Though I warn you, I know more about cattle than carpentry. Sarah's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. I'm sure you'll manage. The list isn't terribly demanding some loose boards on the back porch, a window that sticks, that sort of thing. As they climbed the stairs together toward their respective rooms, Oliver found himself studying Sarah's profile in the dim light of the oil lamp she carried. She was a handsome woman, not in the flashy way of saloon girls or the delicate manner of Eastern ladies, but with the quiet strength and grace that came from facing life's hardships head-on. "Good night, Oliver," she said softly as they reached the landing. "I'm glad you're staying." "Good night, Sarah," he replied, watching as she continued down the hall to her private quarters at the back of the house. "So am I." The next morning, Oliver began his duties as the boarding house's handyman. Though his side still pained him when he moved too quickly, he found he could manage most of the tasks Sarah had listed. He started with the loose boards on the back porch, replacing two that were rotted beyond repair and securing the others with fresh nails. He was sanding down the rough edges of the new boards when Sheriff Daniels appeared around the corner of the house. "Jameson," the lawman greeted him. "Heard you were up and about. Didn't expect to find you playing carpenter." Oliver set aside his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. "Mrs. Abernathy has kindly offered me employment while I recover. What brings you by, Sheriff?" "News." Daniels leaned against the porch railing. "Mexican rurales found the remains of your cattle drive. Most of the herd had been driven south, but they recovered about 40 head that had been left behind when one of Vasquez's men got too badly wounded to travel the one you shot, I reckon." Oliver's pulse quickened. "Where are they now?" "The cattle are being held at a ranch just south of the border. Authorities are trying to sort out ownership, but with your partners dead." The sheriff trailed off significantly. "I'm the sole surviving owner," Oliver finished. "Those 40 head would give me a fresh start." "That's my thinking. I've sent a letter vouching for you, but you'll need to go claim them in person, with whatever proof of ownership you can muster." Oliver ran a hand through his hair, mind racing. Even 40 cattle would be enough to build on. Maybe partner with another small outfit, or sell for capital to invest in something new. "When can I leave?" The sheriff's expression grew more serious. "Not so fast. There's more. 2 of Vasquez's men were captured with the cattle. Under questioning, they admitted the gang is still looking for you. Seems you didn't just wing one of them, you killed Manuel's younger brother." The news hit Oliver like a physical blow. "I didn't know." "Wouldn't have mattered if you had. It was self-defense. But it means Vasquez won't stop until he finds you." The sheriff straightened. "I'm organizing a posse. With the Mexican authorities pushing from the south and us from the north, we might finally corner this gang. And you want me to join. You know what they look like. You've seen their operation, and you've got more reason than most to want them brought to justice." Oliver glanced back at the boarding house, thinking of Sarah inside, probably preparing lunch for her boarders. Getting involved would mean putting himself in danger again, just when he'd found a temporary safe harbor. "Let me think on it," he said finally, "and I need to speak with Mrs. Abernathy about my employment here." The sheriff nodded. "Fair enough. Posse rides in 2 days. Let me know your decision by tomorrow." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Oliver alone with his thoughts. At lunch, Oliver was uncharacteristically quiet, turning over the sheriff's news in his mind. Sarah noticed his preoccupation, but didn't press him in front of the other boarders. It was only later, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the dusty main street, that she broached the subject. "Something's troubling you," she observed, her hands busy with mending work. "Is it your wound?" Oliver shook his head. "No, it's healing well." He took a deep breath. "Sheriff Daniels came by today. They've recovered some of my cattle south of the border." Sarah's face brightened. "Oliver, that's wonderful news." "It is," he agreed. "But there's more to it. The men who stole them, who killed my partners, are still looking for me. It seems I killed the gang leader's brother during the raid." The mending dropped to Sarah's lap, forgotten. "Oh, Oliver. The sheriff is forming a posse to go after them, working with the Mexican authorities. He's asked me to join." Fear flashed across Sarah's face. "But you're still recovering. Surely he can't expect—" "He knows I'm the only one who can identify all of Vasquez's men," Oliver interrupted gently. "And I have more cause than most to want them brought to justice." Sarah was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the street where children played in the last light of day, unaware of the dangers that lurked beyond their small town. "When would you leave?" she finally asked, her voice carefully controlled. "2 days from now, if I agree to go." "And the cattle? You said they found some of your herd." 40 head, being held near the border. I'd need to go claim them in person, prove ownership." Sarah picked up her mending again, though her fingers trembled slightly. "So, either way, you'll be leaving Esperanza." Oliver hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. Whether he joined the posse or simply went to reclaim his cattle, his time at the boarding house was coming to an end. The realization brought an unexpected pang of regret. "I suppose I will," he admitted, "though I hate to leave you without a handyman again so soon." Sarah's laugh held little humor. "I managed before you arrived, Mr. Jameson. I'll manage again." The return to formality wasn't lost on Oliver. He reached out and gently touched her hand, stopping the nervous movement of her needle. "Sarah," he said softly, "I haven't thanked you properly for saving my life. If you hadn't taken me in, cared for me—" "Anyone would have done the same," she demurred, though her hand remained beneath his. "No, not anyone. You saw a stranger at death's door, and you not only gave him shelter, you prayed for his soul." Oliver's voice grew husky with emotion. "I heard you, you know, through the fever. Your voice was like an anchor, keeping me tethered to this world when it would have been easier to let go." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears in the fading light. "I lost my husband because there was no one to care for him properly when the consumption got bad. I couldn't watch another man die when I might help. Well, I'm grateful, more than I can say." He squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "And I'll pay off my debt to you before I leave, one way or another." "There is no debt," she insisted, rising from her chair. "Only the obligation we all have to help our fellow travelers on this difficult road." She gathered her mending. "Good night, Oliver. Whatever you decide, I wish you Godspeed." She disappeared into the house before he could respond, leaving him alone with the gathering darkness and the weight of decisions yet unmade. That night, Oliver slept poorly, his dreams a confused jumble of cattle raids, Sarah's face, and endless dusty trails leading nowhere. He rose before dawn, dressed quietly, and made his way downstairs, careful not to wake the other boarders. To his surprise, Sarah was already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cook stove. "You're up early," she observed, straightening. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Thought I'd make myself useful." Sarah studied him in the soft glow of the lamp she'd lit. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question, but Oliver nodded anyway. "I have. I'm joining the posse. Those men killed my partners, my friends. They need to be brought to justice." Sarah turned away, busying herself with coffee grounds and the percolator. "I suspected as much. You don't strike me as a man who leaves accounts unsettled." "It's more than that," Oliver said, stepping closer. "As long as Vasquez is looking for me, I'm putting everyone around me in danger, including you and your boarders." This brought her eyes back to his, wide with concern. "You think they would come here, to the boarding house?" "I don't know, but I can't risk it." He ran a hand through his hair. "Once they're captured, I'll go claim my cattle, try to rebuild." "And then?" Sarah asked softly. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. In the short time he'd known her, Oliver had come to admire Sarah Abernathy deeply. Her strength, her kindness, her unwavering faith. In another time, another place. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I haven't thought that far ahead." Sarah nodded, accepting his answer, though something like disappointment flickered in her eyes. "Well, if you're riding with the posse, you'll need your strength. Sit down, and I'll make you a proper breakfast before the others wake." As she bustled about the kitchen, Oliver watched her with a growing sense that he was making a mistake. Not in seeking justice that path was clear enough, but in leaving without telling Sarah how he was beginning to feel about her. Yet, what right did he have to speak such thoughts aloud? He was a penniless cowboy with a price on his head. She was a respectable widow with a business to run. The day passed quickly as Oliver prepared for the journey ahead. He visited the general store to purchase ammunition for his revolver, had his horse reshod at the blacksmith's, and spoke at length with Sheriff Daniels about the posse's plans. "We'll ride at first light," the sheriff confirmed. 10 men, including us, all experienced with firearms. The Mexican rurales will meet us near Los Lobos. And if we find Vasquez, we bring him in alive if possible. Dead if necessary. The sheriff's eyes were hard. These men have terrorized both sides of the border long enough. That evening, Sarah insisted on preparing a special dinner for Oliver's last night at the boarding house. She served his favorite foods, beef stew, fresh cornbread, and apple pie still warm from the oven. The other boarders were full of questions about the posse and the notorious Vasquez gang, which Oliver answered as patiently as he could, though his mind was elsewhere. After dinner, as the others retired to the parlor for coffee, Sarah asked Oliver to help her carry some dishes to the kitchen. Once they were alone, she closed the door and turned to him with determined eyes. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into the pocket of her apron. She withdrew a small object and pressed it into his hand. Oliver looked down to find a simple silver cross on a leather cord. "Sarah, I can't accept—" "Please," she interrupted. "It was Edward's. He would want it to protect someone else now." Her fingers closed his around the cross. "Wear it. For my peace of mind, if nothing else." The weight of the gesture wasn't lost on Oliver. This was no small thing, giving away her dead husband's cross to a man she'd known barely 2 weeks. "I'll bring it back to you," he promised, slipping the cord over his head. The cross settled against his chest, warm from her hand. "See that you do," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "I've grown accustomed to having you around, Oliver Jameson. The porch won't fix itself." He smiled at her attempt at lightness. "Is that all I am to you? Free labor?" Sarah's expression softened. "No," she said quietly. "You're much more than that." The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Oliver stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. Sarah didn't pull away, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of apprehension and longing that mirrored his own feelings. "Sarah," he murmured, "I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I'm a man with nothing to offer but trouble at his heels." "I'm not asking for anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the flush spreading across her cheeks. "Except that you return safely." Oliver leaned down, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her the chance to turn away. When she didn't, he closed the distance between them in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened as Sarah's arms wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Oliver rested his forehead against hers. "Now I have another reason to come back," he said softly. "The best reason," she agreed, her eyes shining in the dim kitchen light. They might have stayed that way longer, but a knock at the kitchen door startled them apart. Sarah smoothed her apron as Lillian Winters poked her head in. "Mrs. Abernathy, Mr. Peterson was wondering if there might be more coffee." "Of course," Sarah replied, her composure returning, though her cheeks remained flushed. "I'll bring it right out." After Lillian withdrew, Sarah and Oliver shared a look that held both promise and uncertainty. Then, duty calling, they rejoined their fellow boarders in the parlor, their momentous exchange a secret held close between them. Dawn broke cold and gray the next morning as the posse gathered in front of the sheriff's office. 10 men on horseback, heavily armed, with provisions for a week's journey. Oliver checked his saddlebags one last time, ensuring his meager possessions were secure. His wound still ached dully, but he could ride without difficulty now. He'd said his goodbyes to Sarah privately, earlier that morning. She'd pressed a packet of food into his hands and straightened his collar with fingers that trembled slightly. "Come back to me," she'd whispered, and sealed the request with a kiss that left him dizzy. Now, as Sheriff Daniels gave final instructions to the posse, Oliver touched the silver cross beneath his shirt and silently vowed to honor her request. They rode south under leaden skies. the threat of rain hanging over them as they crossed the Rio Grande at a shallow ford. The Mexican territory beyond was harsh and unforgiving, scrubland dotted with cacti and the occasional stunted mesquite. Oliver rode beside the sheriff, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Rurales said Vasquez was last seen near the Diablo Mountains, Daniels said, pointing to the jagged peaks in the distance. He has a hideout somewhere in those canyons. Needle in a haystack, Oliver observed grimly. Maybe not. One of the captured men gave up some information in exchange for leniency. We have a general location. They made camp that night in a sheltered arroyo, keeping the fires small and posting guards. Oliver took the second watch, sitting with his back against a boulder and his rifle across his knees. The night was alive with desert sounds, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft shifting of horses on their picket lines. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, as they had throughout the day. The feel of her lips on his, the scent of her hair, the way her eyes held his with such honest emotion. It had been years since Oliver had allowed himself to think of a future that included a home, a family. The trail had been his life since the war, moving from one cattle drive to the next, never settling long enough to put down roots. But now, unbidden, he found himself imagining a different path, one where he returned to Esperanza with his cattle, built something lasting, woke each morning to Sarah's smile. It was a dangerous dream for a man who might not survive the week, yet he couldn't banish it from his mind. At dawn, they broke camp and continued south, meeting the Rurales patrol near noon at a designated rendezvous point. The Mexican lawmen were hard-faced and efficient, led by a captain named Rodriguez, who greeted Sheriff Daniels with curt professionalism. "We have tracked Vasquez to a canyon 10 miles east," Rodriguez informed them. "My scout saw smoke from campfires last night. We believe the entire gang is there, perhaps 15 men." The combined force of Posse and Rurales numbered 20 men, not overwhelming odds, but better than Oliver had hoped for. They formulated a plan to approach the canyon from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes and forcing a confrontation on their terms. As they rode toward the canyon, tension mounted. Oliver checked his revolver for the third time. Remembering the faces of Jim and Marcus as they fell beneath Vasquez's bullets. Justice was within reach now, though it would not bring his friends back. The attack came at dusk, when shadows were long and visibility poor. The lawmen had surrounded the canyon, blocking all exits, when a sentry spotted them and raised the alarm. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, echoing off the canyon walls in a deafening cacophony. Oliver took cover behind a boulder as bullets whizzed past, returning fire whenever he spotted movement in the gathering darkness. The battle was chaotic, positions difficult to maintain in the rugged terrain. Men shouted in English and Spanish, the wounded cried out, horses screamed in terror. Through the confusion, Oliver caught sight of a figure running toward a hidden trail, leading up the canyon wall, a man he recognized instantly from the cattle raid. Manuel Vasquez himself, attempting to escape while his men provided covering fire. Without hesitation, Oliver broke from cover and pursued, ignoring the sheriff's shout to hold position. He scrambled up the rocky trail, gaining ground on Vasquez, who was hampered by a pronounced limp perhaps from an earlier injury. At the top of the trail, Vasquez turned, raising his revolver. Oliver dove aside as the shot rang out, feeling the bullet pass close enough to stir his hair. He rolled to his feet, his own weapon leveled, but hesitated at the crucial moment. This man was a murderer and thief, yet taking a life in cold blood went against everything Oliver believed. "Surrender," he called out. "It's over. Vasquez, your men are surrounded." The outlaw's face twisted in hatred. "You killed my brother," he spat in accented English, "for some miserable cattle. And you killed my partners for the same," Oliver replied steadily. "Enough death! Throw down your gun." For a moment it seemed Vasquez might comply. His shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining from him. Then, with terrifying speed, he raised his gun again and fired. Oliver felt the bullet graze his temple as he squeezed his own trigger. His shot was true, striking Vasquez in the chest. The outlaw staggered backward, surprise replacing hatred on his face, before he toppled over the edge of the cliff into the darkness below. In the sudden silence, Oliver became aware of blood trickling down the side of his face. He touched it gingerly, finding a shallow furrow where Vasquez's bullet had scraped past. Another inch, and he would never have seen Sarah again. The thought of her brought his hand to the silver cross still hanging around his neck. It had somehow come free of his shirt during the chase, and now gleamed dully in the faint moonlight. Oliver closed his fist around it, a prayer of thanks on his lips for the second time his life had been spared. The aftermath of the battle was grim but decisive. 3 of Vasquez's men had been killed, including their leader. The rest were captured to face justice on both sides of the border. The posse had suffered casualties as well. 1 man dead, 4 wounded, though none critically. "You disobeyed a direct order," Sheriff Daniels told Oliver, as a rural doctor stitched the wound on his temple. "Could have gotten yourself killed." "Vasquez would have escaped if I hadn't pursued," Oliver replied, wincing as the needle pierced his skin. The sheriff couldn't argue with the result. "Well, it's done now. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude. That gang has been terrorizing folks for too long." "I didn't do it for gratitude," Oliver said quietly. "I did it for Jim and Marcus, and to ensure he couldn't threaten anyone else I care about." Daniels gave him a knowing look. "Mrs. Abernathy will be relieved to hear you've survived. Again." Oliver didn't deny the implication. "I need to see about my cattle," he said instead. "How far are we from where they're being held?" "A day's ride. We'll escort the prisoners back to the border crossing, then I can take you there myself." True to his word, the sheriff accompanied Oliver to the ranch where his recovered cattle were being held. 40 head of prime beef cattle, bearing the Circle J brand, represented a new beginning. With proper documentation and the sheriff's testimony, the Mexican authorities released the animals to Oliver's custody without difficulty. Driving cattle with just 2 men was a challenge, but Daniels recruited 2 vaqueros from the ranch to help them to the border, and the animals were relatively docile after weeks of good grazing. They crossed back into Texas 3 days after the battle, the small herd raising dust as they moved steadily northward toward Esperanza. As they approached the town on the afternoon of the 7th day since Oliver had ridden out with the posse, his heart beat faster. What would Sarah say when she saw him return? Not only alive, but with the means to build a future? Would the feelings they had confessed in the quiet of her kitchen still burn as brightly after a week apart? The sun was setting as they drove the cattle into the town's small stockyard. News of their arrival spread quickly, and a small crowd gathered to hear first-hand accounts of the posse's success against the notorious Vasquez gang. Oliver endured the questions and congratulations with growing impatience, his eyes constantly scanning for one particular face. When he finally extricated himself from the crowd, he handed the remaining cattle logistics to Sheriff Daniels and walked purposefully toward the boarding house, removing his hat as he climbed the familiar steps to the front porch. Before he could knock, the door flew open, and Sarah stood there, her eyes wide and questioning. Her gaze immediately went to the bandage on his temple, and her hand rose to her mouth. "You're hurt," she whispered. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Just a scratch." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the week of separation falling away. Then Sarah stepped forward and threw her arms around him, heedless of the dust that covered his clothes, or the audience of curious boarders who had appeared in the hallway behind her. Oliver held her tightly, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. When she finally pulled back, tears glistened on her cheeks. "You came back," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Oliver reached for the silver cross around his neck and carefully lifted it over his head. "I promised I would," he said, holding it out to her. "And I always keep my promises." Sarah closed her hand around the cross, but didn't take it from him. "Keep it," she said. "It protected you once. I would have it continue to do so." They might have stood there longer, lost in each other, if Mr. Peterson hadn't discreetly cleared his throat behind them. Sarah blushed, suddenly aware of their audience, and stepped back. "You must be hungry," she said, assuming her role as proprietress once more. "Come in, and I'll prepare something." Later that evening, after he had bathed and changed into clean clothes, Oliver joined Sarah in the kitchen, where she was preparing a late supper for him. The other boarders had tactfully retired early, leaving them alone. "Sheriff Daniels tells me you recovered some of your cattle," she said, as she set a plate before him, roast beef, potatoes, and fresh greens from her small garden. 40 head, Oliver confirmed, savoring the simple, delicious food. Not the 200 we started with, but enough to make a fresh start. Sarah sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. What will you do now? Drive them north to Abilene as you originally planned? Oliver set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. That depends. On what? On you, Sarah. Her eyes widened slightly. Me? I've been thinking, Oliver said, choosing his words carefully. Esperanza needs a cattle operation, good grazing land around here, access to markets both north and south. A man with some experience and a small herd could build something worthwhile. You're thinking of staying, Sarah said softly, hope beginning to brighten her eyes. I'm thinking of building something permanent, something lasting. He reached across the table for her hand. But I wouldn't want to do it alone. Sarah's fingers trembled in his. Oliver, are you asking what I think you're asking? It's sudden, I know, he acknowledged. We've known each other barely 3 weeks, but I've lived enough to recognize what matters. When I was lying in that bed, burning with fever, your voice was my anchor to this world. When I was tracking Vasquez through that canyon, your face was what I saw in my mind. He rose from his chair and, still holding her hand, dropped to one knee beside her. Sarah Abernathy, I arrived at your door a half-dead stranger, and you saved my life with your care and your prayers. I have nothing to offer but my heart, my hands, and 40 head of cattle, but if you'll have me, I swear before God, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Tears spilled freely down Sarah's cheeks now, but her smile was radiant. 3 weeks ago, I prayed beside the bed of a dying cowboy, asking God to spare his life if it was his will. I never imagined I was also praying for my own future happiness. She pulled him to his feet and into her arms. Yes, Oliver Jameson. Yes, I will marry you. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender and full of hope for the life they would build together. When they finally parted, Oliver pressed his forehead to hers. I should warn you, he said with a smile in his voice. I know far more about cattle than I do about being a husband. Sarah laughed, her joy bubbling over. And I know more about running a boarding house than being a rancher's wife. We'll learn together. Together, Oliver agreed, tightening his arms around her. I like the sound of that. They were married 2 weeks later in Esperanza's small church, with Sheriff Daniels standing as Oliver's best man and Lillian Winters as Sarah's attendant. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, the union of the widow Abernathy and the cowboy who had helped bring down the Vasquez gang being a matter of considerable local interest. The first year was not without challenges. Oliver purchased a small tract of land outside town and built a modest ranch house with the help of neighbors and the proceeds from selling a few of his cattle. Sarah maintained the boarding house until they were established, gradually transitioning it to new owners as the ranch demanded more of her attention. They named their spread the Silver Cross Ranch, in honor of the talisman that had twice played a role in bringing them together. The small herd grew steadily as Oliver applied the knowledge he'd gained through years on cattle drives, selectively breeding for hardiness and beef quality. Sarah proved to be a quick study in ranch operations, keeping meticulous records and managing the household with the same efficiency she had applied to her boarding house. Together, they weathered drought, market fluctuations, and the normal difficulties of frontier life, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Oliver's mother. Standing beside his wife's bed, holding his newborn child, Oliver was overcome with gratitude for the fever that had nearly killed him, but had instead led him to this moment of perfect joy. "She's beautiful," he whispered, carefully returning the infant to Sarah's arms. "Just like her mother." Sarah smiled tiredly up at him. "She has your chin, and I suspect she'll have your stubborn nature as well." "God help us all if that's true," Oliver laughed, sitting on the edge of the bed and wrapping an arm around his wife's shoulders. "One hard-headed Jameson in the family is quite enough." As if in agreement, baby Margaret yawned and settled more comfortably against her mother's breast, her tiny fingers flexing in sleep. "I never thought I would have this," Sarah admitted softly. "After Edward died, I resigned myself to a life alone. The boarding house was to be my legacy. And now? Oliver prompted, brushing a strand of honey-colored hair from her forehead. Sarah looked down at their daughter, then up at her husband, her blue eyes filled with a contentment that needed no words. But she spoke them anyway, for the joy of giving voice to the truth. Now, my life feels complete in a way I never imagined possible. You and Margaret are my legacy, Oliver. This family we've made. The Silver Cross Ranch prospered in the years that followed. Oliver's herd grew to over 300 head, and he added horses to their operation, developing a line of sturdy cow ponies that gained renown throughout the territory. Sarah, never content to be merely a housewife, established a small dairy operation that supplied butter and cheese to Esperanza and nearby settlements. Margaret was joined by a brother, James, named after Oliver's fallen partner, and later by another sister, Elizabeth. The Jameson children grew up strong and capable, at home both in the saddle and in the schoolhouse, where Mr. Peterson still taught with undiminished enthusiasm. On the 10th anniversary of the day Oliver had first awakened from his fever to find Sarah praying beside his bed, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. Friends from town joined them, including Sheriff Daniels, now gray-haired but still serving as Esperanza's lawman, and Lillian Winters, who had eventually married a cattle buyer from San Antonio and now had 3 children of her own. As twilight fell, Oliver found Sarah standing alone on the porch, watching their guests laugh and dance in the yard where lanterns had been strung between trees. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Jameson," he said, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Sarah leaned back against him, her hands covering his. At 40, she was still as beautiful to him as she had been at 30, the years adding character to her face, but taking nothing from the warmth of her smile or the kindness in her eyes. "I was thinking about prayers," she replied, "about how God answers them in ways we never expect." Oliver nodded, his chin brushing her hair. "Like a half-dead cowboy showing up on your doorstep?" "Exactly like that." She turned in his arms to face him. 10 years ago today, I was certain I was watching you die. I prayed for a miracle. And got one," he finished, touching the small silver cross she now wore on a chain around her neck, his gift to her on their 5th anniversary. "As did I." Sarah's eyes grew serious. "Do you ever regret it? Settling down here instead of continuing the life you knew?" Oliver looked past her to where their children played with their friends, to the well-built ranch house and the healthy cattle in the distant pasture, to the community that had embraced them both. "Not for a single moment," he answered truthfully. "The trail was my life because I had nothing else. Now, I have everything." He kissed her then, a decade of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges in the gesture. When they parted, Sarah took his hand and led him back to join their guests, their fingers intertwined as they had been since that fateful night in her kitchen when a wounded cowboy and a widowed boarding house keeper had found in each other the future neither had dared to imagine. As the celebration continued around them, music playing, children laughing, friends sharing stories, Oliver and Sarah Jameson stood at the center of the life they had built together. Their beginning, as unlikely as it had been, providential. A fever, a prayer, and the courage to begin again had given them this moment, this family, this love that had only strengthened with the passing years. And in the quiet of their hearts, they each offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together, and for the faith that had sustained them through it all. For a woman who had once prayed beside the bed of a dying stranger, and for a man who had awakened to find his future gazing back at him with hope-filled blue eyes.